Can I begin?
Yeah, I'll start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Growing Up in Science with Roozbeh Kiani. We have a live audience here and or an in-person audience as well as a Zoom audience. Thank you all for joining us. If the Zoom audience wants to turn their cameras on, that's something that I always really appreciate, because then we have this sense of talking to people. But of course, it's up to you. Is this the first Growing Up in Science event for anyone here? Oh, hi, there's a whole group there. If some of you are new to Growing Up in Science, very briefly, this is a series in which we highlight the personal stories behind a scientist's life and career. These are stories that we often don't hear, especially if you're trainees. You might not know these the struggles and difficulties that your professors faced during their careers, and maybe even now. And there are certain themes that come up in Growing Up in Science that we believe need to be talked about more often, about sort of the human factors of doing science. Really excited to have Roozbeh as our guest today. I've known Roozbeh for a long time, but I still learned things about you from your unofficial story. Are you okay with questions during, or would you prefer to have them at the end? Okay, all right. Questions during are fine. So Zoom audience can just type them. I'll keep an eye on the chat, that's pretty much all I'm going to do in terms of introduction. All right, Roozbeh, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's quite an honor to talk to you all today and share part of my story. I've been following up Growing Up in Science for a while, and I'm always surprised by intricacies and complexities that all of my colleagues have faced. I'm going to share a few highlights of my personal life, hoping that there are lessons there for everyone to learn. And I would be more than happy to get questions and get deeper into any of the topics that you are interested in. Because the majority of people today are on Zoom, I'm going to look at this camera, but please, it's like it's always difficult, like who I'm looking at and how engaging with people. Okay, so let me begin. I was born in the year of the Iranian Revolution, and my church and my early childhood coincided with deep changes in the Iranian society. There was civil strife, deep political chasms among different factions in the society, and an 8-year war that started a couple of years after the revolution and ended when I was 10 years old. I have clear memories of large gatherings and demonstrations, gruesome violence, and harsh voice of my parents discussing politics and war. My dad is an otolaryngologist. My mom, a chemistry teacher. Both of them love their country, their town, and family. Neither were particularly political, but they knew about politics. They were quite knowledgeable, and they were eager to find ways to help their fellow citizens, the town and the country. My hometown, Amol, is located on a narrow piece of land squeezed between the Caspian Sea on the north and Alborz Range on the south. It is about 100 miles north of the capital of Iran, Tehran. Like most places in Iran, Amol is an ancient city. It was founded about 1000 BC. And it has weathered many invasions, revolutions, kings, and khans. The people of Amol are well-educated and well-cultured. I was lucky to live my formative years among them, learning their traditions and customs, and understanding the value of knowledge, happiness, and compassion. But the time that I grew up in was quite a special too. The forces of revolution that were tearing up the fabric of the Iranian society were particularly strong, and especially in my hometown. One of the first lessons that I learned as a kid was that with a little bit of knowledge comes opinion. And if opinions are not checked, they can lead to harmful actions. It's the, I think, the exact instantiation of Alexander Pope's poem that a little bit of learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pyrenean spring. And I learned as a kid that when it comes to politics and religion, there is no drinking deep because there is no ultimate truth. There is nothing that you can verify. So the thing that is most valuable, the best thing that you can do is to have an open mind, listen, be creative, and tolerant. And that was the thing that was largely lacking at the time that I was growing up. On January 25th, 1982, the Union of Iranian Communists, which had a relatively strong base in the north of Iran, led an armed uprising in my hometown, Amol, against the Islamic Republic, the dominant government at the time. They had the intention of establishing a revolutionary base in my hometown. Now, the armed rebellion was crushed overnight, but the memory of that night remains alive in my head. I was only 4 years old, and I was initially amused by the bang bang sound from the outside. I thought they were firecrackers. I did not even know the concept of bullets at the time. But my amusement was quickly replaced by extreme fear when I realized that there was a wounded fighter armed with grenades on our front porch, left there by his comrades who knew we had a doctor in the house, my dad. My dad and a brave neighbor stabilized the wounded fighter and took him to the town hospital, driving with bullets whizzing around them. Unfortunately, I accumulated a few of these memories before I was 10 years old. Missile attacks on cities during the Iraqi invasion of Iran, my dad getting injured in bombing of a hospital by Iraqi airplanes, refugee crisis because of the war, and so on. But my childhood was not that gory and violent overall. I was among the most fortunate kids of my generation, I think. I had an educated and supportive family. I had good friends. I had amazing teachers in a school who went above and beyond to make life seem as normal as possible. And that was despite the chaos that all of us lived in. They taught me that although encounters with violence leave deep impressions in our memories, we are not defined by those memories. Perspective matters, and we can choose what we focus on. Now, my most educational experiences did not happen in a school, even though I was really lucky with my teachers. They happened during summer when we visited my grandfather's ranch deep in the Alborz range. We went on daily hikes. We fished for trout, we watched wild animals, we cooked on campfire, and we looked at the stars at night. Every observation became a question in my head, every question an exciting path to learn about physics, chemistry, astronomy, biology. Those became my favorite subjects at the school too. There was something neat and simple about them. They were based on observations, facts, verifiable laws, quite different from the subjective and messy realms of religion and politics. The more I learned about them, the more I loved them, and the more I wanted to learn about them. My mom, a chemistry teacher, had a good collection of advanced chemistry books. I browsed them frequently. And when I was in the 11th grade and learned about the science Olympiads, I thought that, well, I would give it a try. I didn't think I would win the competition. How can a boy from a small forgotten town in a war-torn country win an international competition? My initial goal was really to gain experience and learn what I did not know so that I can learn more. I participated in the national selection exam and did reasonably well enough to be invited to the training camp in Tehran. We were 40 students in the capital, in the chemistry camp, and the same number of students participated for the other science Olympiads, math, physics, computer science. Now, the camp was really eye-opening. I had an amazing experience there. The students were from all over the country. Iran is a relatively big country with many dialects and different cultures, subcultures that exist there, and different languages even. And interacting with them taught me a lot about the diversity that exists in my country and around me. The other thing that was very eye-opening for me was that even though many people there were really intelligent, they were geniuses by any, I don't know, objective definition of the word. Many of them were humble, they were friendly, they would interact, they would teach you things. So I quickly became like a sponge, absorbing everything that I could and trying to build as much as I could on my existing knowledge. The competition was fierce, but I think I got lucky and somehow I made it to the final team. Now, a few months later, I was on a plane to Beijing in China to represent Iran in the International Chemistry Olympiad. I had one mission for myself, to do as well as I could in the competition. But after we landed and reached the hotel, I realized that I had a giant blind spot. A couple hundred students from all around the world had gathered together, representing almost all major languages, traditions, customs, an ideal place for a 17 or 18-year-old, which I was at the time, to make friends and learn about the world. Years later, I know that that was really the main benefit of participating in the competition. But we did well in chemistry too. The Iranian team won 4 gold medals. About 10% of the participants in science Olympiads win gold medals. And I won the top gold medal of the competition thanks to a change of mind in one of the most difficult questions that led me to an unconventional solution, which happened to be correct. So again, I kind of got lucky. I left the competition with great memories and a yearning to one day work in an international scene where I can actually be exposed to the diversity that I experienced there. It really left a very big impression in my mind. After returning from the chemistry Olympiad, I began planning for college. Chemistry was the obvious choice. Almost everyone around me was guiding me in that direction. My doctor dad was the biggest proponent of me continuing chemistry. My chemist mom was kind of open-minded, and she was encouraging me to also explore alternatives. The fact is, I was really not sure what I wanted to do. I thought that I needed time to explore myself, to learn myself better. Medicine offered a potential avenue forward. I found it quite exciting. It was very challenging at the time. I admired what my dad was doing and also my older brother who had recently started studying medicine. And the special medical system, medical training system in Iran gave me the time that I thought I needed to really figure myself out. The Iranian medical training system is very similar to European system. You enter it from high school. You have about 2 years to 3 years of basic science education, anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and so on. And then after that, you go to hospitals to do your externship and internship in the coming 5 or 6 years. I thought that that time was really useful for me to figure out what I wanted to do. Now, as I started the medical school, I quickly learned that there are a lot of things that I didn't know. Anatomy classes were quite interesting, especially when it came to the anatomy of the brain. I was introduced to the complexity and counterintuitive aspects of the brain organization. Counterintuitive, especially from the perspective of someone who did not know much about the evolution of the brain. Why exactly things are organized in the way that they are organized. And then when the physiology course came, I started to learn more about the function of those weird parts. I also noticed that our professors were really scrambling to explain different aspects of how the brain works. When it came to the eye, they knew a little bit. As soon as you got past the eye and went deeper into the central nervous system, oh man, no one really knew what was going on. That was in very sharp contrast to almost every other system that I studied in physiology. The heart, well, we know reasonably well. Kidneys, lungs, muscles. There are some mysteries, but I would say the general principles are well known. The brain, no one even knows where to look for those general principles, or at least that was the case 20 years ago when I was in medical school. Okay, so I thought I had found my calling. I thought that I knew what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, but I had no idea how exactly I wanted to do that. I did not even know something like neuroscience existed at the time. Initially, I felt lucky that, okay, I'm in medical school. That means that I can become a neurologist or a neurosurgeon. That's probably the closest to a brain scientist that I could imagine at the time. But then through some strike of fortune, I came across a group of students, like-minded medical students, who were talking more or less the same language and wanted to know about the mysteries of the brain. There was a journal club. We would go there once a week, and everyone would share the most recent thing that they had learned about the brain. Gradually, as time passed, we became more and more organized. We learned how to scavenge all the major libraries of medical schools in Tehran and find all the basic science books about the brain. We made connections with the outside world so that we can somehow put our hands on copies of papers, recently published papers. Remember that, like, back then in late 1990s and early 2000s, internet was not very accessible in Iran, and the journals were also not very accessible. So the only way that we could actually read things was to find a physical copy of a book or a journal, photocopy it, as many as we could, distribute it among the group, and then get together to present it to ourselves. And it was kind of weird because we really didn't know much neuroscience, but we also did not have knowledgeable sources, or we did not know about knowledgeable sources. As time passed, gradually we started to make connections with IPM, Institute of Fundamental Physics and Sciences in Iran. And through there, we found a group of highly talented and enthusiastic professors who also wanted to study the brain. One of them that I was very lucky to know at the time was Hossein Asteki. He had recently completed his postdoctoral training and in Riken in Japan. And he had returned to Iran with the intention of establishing a monkey electrophysiology lab. That was way above anything that had been created in the country or had been developed in the country at the time. And Hossein found us, or we found Hossein, and he took a special interest in a subgroup of students within our journal club. And we started our own private journal club with Hossein. Few months passed, and by the way, Hossein was a professor in my medical school, the Beheshti medical school. So a few months passed, and gradually I felt that, okay, like a few things are clicking in my head. Some of the things that were total mysteries before now are kind of making sense. Just to be clear, I was still totally lost, but I was feeling that I was gradually coming above the water. I could see some air or breathe some air. So that total confusion was gradually lifting. So in a moment of boldness, I found the courage to go to Hossein's office. I knocked at the door and I asked him if he has a few minutes. And he was very kind, as always. He said, come in. And I told him that, look, I'm really intrigued by everything that we are learning and all the discussions that we have. But I'm a person that needs to do things with his hands if I really want to learn something in the true sense of it. I want to be able to put whatever that we are learning in the form of an experiment. I want to do experiments. How exactly I can do that? Now, so far, the only thing that we had done was running a few psychophysical experiments here or there, imagining how psychophysics could be done, and venturing into collecting small batches of data. And Hossein told me that, oh, come here, I will show you something. We walked together to a relatively large room, and it was packed with equipment. Hossein had received a grant from RICON to advance basic sciences in third world countries. And he had come to Iran with very large amount of equipment, some of them really old equipments, like a dual time window discriminator that Keiji Tanaka had made with his own hands 20 years before that. But they were all the ingredients that we actually needed to create a lab. And Hossein said, well, these equipments will become a monkey electrophysiology lab. Would you like to help and be involved? And I was extremely enthusiastic, and my immediate response was, yes, of course. I have absolutely no idea how to do it, but yes, I'm in. And then we started. At the time, I knew computer programming relatively well, and we had some ideas about the first experiments that we wanted to do. Hossein is extremely savvy, and he had planned everything years ahead. So I think once we started, we could really make fast progress. And we're also quite lucky because there was another student who knew about hardware. There were students who were good at experimental design. But together, everyone put their heads together, and we made the first monkey electrophysiology lab. Then came the challenge of finding monkeys. How you would find monkeys to experiment on in a country that does not have a breeding facility. Well, the answer was to find monkeys from zoos. So our first monkey came from Tehran Zoo. Zoos usually get monkeys at a small age, and when monkeys grow older, they become a little bit mean and they are not as cute. So they want to replace them with younger monkeys, and they would look for places to send monkeys to. And our lab was one of the places that volunteered to receive monkeys. We also had some other sources, some of them shadier than zoos, and I will not go into them. But overall, it was fun. So we got our first monkeys. We did our first surgeries. We really planned everything very well to the extent that we could. But then once the implants were on and we wanted to train monkeys, we didn't know, or at least I didn't know exactly where to start. The first challenge for me was to teach the monkey to fix it. Now, I had developed the eye tracking program, and I had assembled the camera system that Hossein had bought. But no one really had told us how this can be done. So given something as basic as if you put a creature that can see in a dark room and just flash light, the creature would look at it. Were things that we had to invent, or we had to reinvent. Effectively, we reinvented the wheel in so many different ways, trying to create our local version of what is really established procedure here in the United States. Another challenge that was amusing at the time was that, well, if we are putting our animals on water control, then we need to give them a very balanced diet that has all the necessary elements, nutrients, and minerals and vitamins. And that thing should not have salt or things that could potentially be harmful for a water control animal. But unlike here, where you can just place an order for chows to a chow making company, we didn't have that option. There was no chow making company. So we decided that we would make our own chow. We found a local bakery. Hussein would get the ingredients that we had carefully measured and assembled to the bakery and would ask the baker man to cook the chow for us. Effectively, that was a type of bread. The guy thought that he was making a bread. And one of the things that, yeah, and he thought that he was making them for human consumption. So one of the things that he told us one day was that, well, like this bread that you guys are asking me to make is really tasteless. You can't eat it. So I took the liberty to add a little bit of oil and salt to this batch. And we were like, oh man, you just ruined the whole batch of biscuits for our monkeys. So it's like we had to really fight hard for every minute detail in order to be able to do our experiments.
But could you tell the baker eventually?
No, we never told the baker. Or at least not during the time that I was there. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how things work at this moment, but at the time we kept it a secret because I don't know, a baker that bakes for humans may not be very happy to bake for animals. And yeah, it depends on like what the self-image that they have. We didn't want to shatter that. Yeah, so we moved forward, we pressed on. And again, I think we got to a large extent lucky. It is true that we had planned very carefully, but anyone who has done experiments knows that there are so many variables that you can't really and fully control. So what you end up doing is always depending on a little bit of luck, that implants would not fail, recordings would move on, animals would learn the task. The hypothesis that you imagine would actually pay off and would be compatible with how the brain works. Things could have taken a very different route, but they didn't. And the very first experiments that we started in the lab were successful. One experiment that I was involved in required recording from neurons in the ventral visual pathway of monkeys, area infratemporal cortex. And we were trying to understand the selectivity of those cells and what exactly they would represent. The vision that we had was that if we use a very large number of images, something that was not done at the time, we might be able to find regularities in the responses of neurons. And after collecting the data, I started exploring, well, what are the rules, how exactly this relatively complex thing is organized. And one afternoon, I remember I was learning about hierarchical clustering techniques, the unsupervised clustering techniques. And I was trying to put something together to know how the population of infratemporal cortex groups the images. And if two images elicit more or less similar responses in the population of IT neurons, well, maybe they are sharing something that is effectively the way that infratemporal cortex works. So I remember I was writing my programs, and at the time I was writing many of these programs in C, which is a relatively time-consuming thing for doing a lot of these analyses. And I wrote my program and I ran it, and I looked at the first output, and the first output was truly amazing. I saw that all the faces, we had a stimulus set of more than 1,000 images. Then I saw that all the faces in the image were together, as if like IT was treating them more or less similarly. And then the bodies were divided into various small subgroups, like animal bodies in one subgroup and butterflies in the other thing. And then hands and faces were themselves divided into subgroups, like you had human faces in one subgroup and animal faces in another subgroup, and so forth, so on. And initially I thought that this is odd. I did not give my program any information about the identity of these images. And I must have made a mistake because the organization is just too regular. I looked at my code and I realized that no, it's perfectly fine. It's doing exactly as it was supposed to work, and such an organization actually exists in IT. That was a moment that I was like, wow, this seems really, really interesting. And then I started asking questions that what exactly gives rise to this organization. For example, if you simulate a V1-like tuning curve and feed these images into that and get the output of the simulated V1 neurons to look at the clustering of the images, would you get a similar clustering? The answer was no, you get a very different clustering. Well, how about color? How about texture? How about this part of like simple forms? All of them would fail. IT cortex was, it seemed to separate animates from inanimates, or at least within our stimulus set. And within the animates, there was a relatively full hierarchy of meaningful categories that seem to be represented in the population of IT. And at that point, I got a little bit bolder and I was like, well, what if I take some of the existing models of IT, like at the time, Tommy Poggio had a model that many people thought is a good approximation of what happens in the temporal cortex. And I was lucky enough to be able to get part of the code and fill the gaps myself. And I fed the images into that. And again, the answer would be very different to what the IT cortex was doing. So at that point, I kind of convinced myself that we really have something here. I still don't understand how IT arrives at the selectivity that I'm observing in the data, but there is something here. That became the basis of a line of investigation that I followed later in a variety of forms, some of that in collaboration with Nico Kriegscourt, currently at Columbia, who decided to repeat the same experiment, but this time with fMRI in humans. And one very important insight that Nico had was that, well, the methods that we had developed to compare the IT responses in monkeys with models of various parts of the visual cortex could also be applied to comparing electrophysiological recordings in monkeys to fMRI data in humans. Now we are talking about two very different techniques, two different species, but as long as you have a common stimulus space that you can use as input to these different systems and data collection methods, then you can get the output of them and look at the similarity or dissimilarity of the responses that you record and ask whether the organization that those responses have in the space of the input that you have generated in the image space would match or don't match. And Nico found that there is actually a very close match between the organization of images based on IT responses in monkeys and based on bold responses in voxels of human temporal cortex. Another line of investigation that, again, I was lucky enough to be involved in Hosein's lab was microstimulation of the intertemporal cortex. Arash Afraz was leading that study. Arash is currently a professor at NIMH, leading his own lab. And at the time, Arash was very interested to know if the face selective neurons in inferotemporal cortex are in fact contributing to perception of faces. And he had this idea that if we place electrodes and inject currents and bias the responses of neurons or alter the responses of face selective neurons, maybe we would also be able to alter the behavior of the monkey. So if, for example, you show them a noise stimulus, they may see faces in that noise stimulus and they would respond, this is a face-like image. And similar attempts to establish causal relationships between IT cortex and behavior have been done in a few other labs with not much success. I can go into the details of like the insightful choices that were made in Arash's experiment that led to the success. But bottom line, we got a little bit lucky and we had some insights that worked. And Arash could show that, well, by altering the responses of face patches in IT, you can actually change the perception of the animal, or at least the responses of the animal in a face, non-face selection task.
I want to quickly go back to your life at the time, because you were still a medical student, right?
I wasn't still a medical student.
Sounds like an advanced PhD student.
Yes, I was a medical student, and I was spending actually most of my time in the hospital. I remember I was doing my internship rotations at the time, and I had to be at the hospital usually before 7 a.m. Tehran is a relatively big city with really bad traffic. Like the image that may be familiar with most people here is Mexico City. It's like, have that in mind, the traffic of Mexico City. So I had to leave my home usually around 5 a.m. to be able to make it to the hospital before 7 so that I would be present for the ground rounds. And then I would do my hospital duties, usually late into the afternoon, and then I would rush to the lab to run my experiments, do my recordings, do my coding, and usually I would finish after midnight. And then I would walk back from lab to home, and next morning the same schedule would repeat. And that continued for almost a couple of years. I found very little time for that. I think one of the benefits of medical school is that it teaches you how to put yourself on overdrive. One of my chief residents used to joke that like she had finally learned how to restore a sleep. And I think like when you put your body through certain exercises and there are actual demands on you to deliver, and if you're young, you can do it. I'm pretty sure that I can't live that lifestyle again at this moment. But somehow at the time we managed.
What was it like? You really loved your research. The hospital work was sort of getting through the day, where you thought both putting or.
I enjoyed both of them, but I was really going through my hospital chores, hoping that I would get back to the lab sooner. There are a lot of benefits in practicing medicine. There is this thing, instant gratification. When you can do something for a patient and the patient improves, you feel really happy, or at least I felt really happy. But at the same time, I felt that my chores in medical school were tedious. Like the first few times that I would treat a patient or a particular disease, it felt good because it was novel, but very soon it would become repetitive, for me. And that was in big contrast to the lab, where almost every day there was a new challenge that I had to solve. And I think like even though I enjoyed medicine, deep down I knew that I wouldn't really be a practicing doctor if I have an option to do research.
Yeah, I'm hearing that my questions are not easy to hear, so I'm going to inch a little bit closer.
Sure.
Hope this is better. Also, there was a question from Mike Landy.
Hey, Roozbeh.
Hey, Mike.
So long before I met you, I heard about this mystical, magical journal club in Tehran via the many people who either came to NYU or applied to come to NYU and eventually became people in the field. So who were your co-students in that journal club and then later co-students in that lab while you were in Tehran?
Well, there were a lot of talented people, I would say tens, and many of them are now here in the US or in different places in Europe. It would be too many to name all, but there are a few names that I very closely collaborated with at the time. Arash Afraz is one of them. He is currently at NIMH. Behrad Nodust, he was a graduate student in Hussein's lab, and later a postdoc in Thierry Moore's lab at Stanford. Surprisingly, we overlapped with each other again in the US. And
he's now a close friend of mine, by the way.
Yeah. Yes, you told me about that. And now he is at the University of Utah. Kurosh Mirpur was another PhD student in Hussein's lab. He is in James Bisley's lab as a research scientist. those were the people that I think I interacted with the most, at least in the lab. But at IPM, there were a lot of very, very good people. So many of you may have read Alison Abbott's piece in Nature. I think it was called like Brain Trust in Tehran or something like that, where he mentions the story of three Arashes who signed something in blood that they would do something like this mystical aspect that Mike was referring to. I think like there was very good journalism in that piece, but the three Arashes, Arash Afraz, Arash Yazdanbakhsh, and Arash Fazl, they were prominent members of the journal club that we had together. There was Bakhtash Babadi, Bahadur Bahrami. It's like there were a lot of very, very good people who currently hold positions in various capacities, and I'm fortunate enough to be in touch with them. Yeah, somehow, it's like sometimes life puts you in advantageous positions, and I think by just sheer luck, we had a group of really talented people, and I think like more than talented, a group of really interested people, persistent people that got together and decided to do something. And despite all the odds, I think the persistence was the thing that carried us through.
You have time, let's move to the next part of your life.
Sure, yes. Okay, so after I finished my first round of experiments in Hosein's lab, I thought that, well, because I don't want to pursue medicine, I want to switch to science, and I want to do a PhD. I thought that I was in a really good position with a lot of experimental experience and reasonable theoretical background. And I proudly applied to a variety of graduate programs. And I was rejected from all of them. Everyone said no. And I was scratching my head thinking, wow, what else do these people want? Why am I hearing no from everywhere? Of course, the problem was that I was writing my own application from my own perspective and not knowing how graduate admission committees really work. And I did not have the right type of connections because I grew up in the Iranian system. Iranian system is a reasonably good system, but it's kind of a mystery for people outside of Iran. And when professors here receive an application from Iran, unless they have some intimate knowledge of how the educational system works, it would be very difficult for them to evaluate it. Now, based on that experience, I'm of course extremely sensitive when I receive international applications because I read them with the knowledge that the person who is writing the application may not be totally familiar with the system here. And it's kind of my responsibility to know and learn about the system that they were brought up in. When I receive applications from China, India, or a lot of other countries that I'm not closely familiar with, I always reach out to colleagues who are familiar with those systems and ask for advice. But anyway, the rejections in the first year were kind of harsh. And I thought that, well, I will give it another shot, but this time with better planning and maybe better reconnaissance of what is going on. And part of my reconnaissance was actually to come to the US to present my work in the Society for Neuroscience meeting. I think that was in 2003. And I was really hoping that I would be able to meet some of the people that I really admire, at least from outside. Like I remember when I was reading the photocopied chapters of Kendall's book, when I reached to the section that was about motion perception, and I read about Tony Mofshin and Bill Newsom and Mike Shadman and the collective work that they had done in V1, MT, interparietal cortex, prefrontal cortex. I was looking at it and was like, wow, this is really so elegant. This is so close to the type of thing that I want to do, connecting the neural responses in one part of the brain to behavior and doing that in a way that is computationally very insightful. So this group was really the top people that I wanted to talk to. And at the SFN meeting, I saw Mike and I asked if he has a few minutes. And he was also kind enough to come to my poster. So I invited him to my poster. He came to my poster. And I told him, well, would it be possible for me to come and visit your lab? And again, Mike, being Mike, extremely supportive and always enthusiastic about new experiences. He said, yes. So he actually invited me and said that I would pay for your ticket, come to Seattle, visit my lab, see what's going on. I went to Seattle, I gave a talk. It wasn't really a very good talk, but Mike, I think he closed his eyes on that and he said, well, I think you're good, you should come here. And I said, yes, okay. He somehow found a way to put my application in the middle of the stack and push it a little bit higher so that I can actually get in through the admission committee. And a few months later, I was in Seattle. I remember when I landed in Seattle, I had 2 big suitcases, very little money, and really no connection. Mike invited me to spend the first couple of weeks in his home. That was extremely kind of him. And he introduced me to a lot of things, even like helped me open a bank account at the time, coming from Iran, sanctions, blah, blah. It's extremely difficult to integrate in the American society. And without Mike's help, it would have been really difficult for me to say, rent an apartment in Seattle, open a bank account, and do all of these like extremely basic things. So that's another thing that I'm very sensitive to, especially when international students or international postdocs join the lab. I think it's very important to not assume that they can figure everything out themselves. Maybe they are intelligent and they can figure out if the playing ground was level, but sometimes the playground is really not level, and a little bit of help would go a long way to remove a stress. Mike's lab was amazing in many ways, I would say. Mike himself is very insightful, very intuitive, very supportive. From the examples that I told you, I guess I conveyed the right picture. But it was not just Mike. Everyone in Mike's lab kind of shared those features. And somehow Mike always manages to make a lab that feels like family. And interacting with graduate students and postdocs, and also Mike's collaborators at the time, was very educational. One group of collaborators that I had the honor of working with and learning from was Alex Pouget's group. Wei Ji was a postdoc in Alex's lab at the time. And so was Jeff Beck. And one of the papers that was really influential in my mind at the time was the paper that Wei Ji published with Alex. I think it was in Nature Neuroscience 2006 paper about probabilistic population code. And later on, Jeff followed that up, showing that LIP neurons at the time of choice may be representing the probability of being correct. And that was a cue for me that, well, maybe I should look into how this thing works. What does it mean to have a notion of probability of being correct? And that led to a series of studies that I did with Mike on confidence and potential representations of it in various parts of the brain and how it could be used in behavior. And those were good. I enjoyed them. I liked them. Seattle was also my favorite place for, I don't know, as a person who had recently come to the United States, because it has tall mountains. The Cascades is really the place that I enjoyed very much. There were many days that I would finish my experiments, then get in my car, drive for an hour to get to a mountain so that I can climb it. I would climb it until like 8 p.m. and then come back and do the same thing the next day. It was relatively intense, but at the same time, I felt that I was learning a lot and I was moving myself forward.
Were you very homesick?
I was, partly because I felt I was stuck. As an Iranian who had entered the United States, I was given a single entry visa. So for those of you who don't know, it means that you can enter the country, but if you leave the country, your visa would be void. And in order to re-enter the country, you have to reapply for a visa. Now, reapplying for a visa is challenging for an Iranian. And during my whole PhD, I had to stay in the United States. I could not leave. And even though the US is a big country, it's effectively a continent, I felt the feeling that I could not really go back home was always weighing heavy on me. But I could manage. Again, Mike's lab was really like a family, and Mike himself was extremely supportive. And I managed to find a very good group of friends, especially also outside of the University of Washington. I became a member of the Alpine Club of Boeing, and we climbed a lot of difficult mountains and glaciers. This is another thing that I would strongly recommend to graduate students and postdocs, that try to create also a life outside of the lab for yourself. It helps you, it opens your mind, it expands your horizons, it gives you a lot of new experiences. And for me, like hanging out with Boeing engineers was really useful. I learned a lot from them. Not just about science and engineering, but also about life in general and how things work outside of academia. And I think that was a very useful experience. Now I finished my PhD and I wanted to do a postdoc. I applied to only one lab at the time, and that was Bill Newsom's lab. It was a very risky choice at the time because Mike was a postdoctoral fellow in the Newsom lab, and I had already done my PhD with Mike. And many people advised me against going to Bill's lab. But I knew what type of science I wanted to do. I knew that Bill was supportive, and I knew that Bill's lab had a lot of resources. And Bill is also the type of person that would give me absolute freedom to implement my ideas. That was Bill's philosophy. And it worked out well. So despite all potential challenges, I did a relatively short but good postdoc. Again, I learned a lot. My postdoc was about 3 years long. And then I entered the job market, and NYU was very kind to give me a home. So I would say I did the full circle from Chatelain to Newsom to Moffitt.
How many places did you apply for faculty jobs?
Yeah, so in the year that I got into NYU, I think I applied for 4 places, maybe 5. I got 2 offers and a few rejections. But by the time that I was applying for faculty positions, I knew rejection is part of the business. The rejections were significantly less negative impact on my psyche compared to rejections from graduate school. I think that's also one of the things that I learned and I heard from a lot of people. I remember one of the persons that I visited back in the time when in my first visit to the US was Peter Schiller at MIT. And Peter is an extremely frank and honest person. And he sat me down and he said, look, what do you want to do? Asked very significant, straightforward questions. And then he told me that, look, I have one advice for you. If you are designing experiments, shoot for a failure rate of 50% or 2/3, like 50 to 60%. And at the time I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't design experiments to fail. I design experiments to succeed. I design experiments so that I would find data that would support my hypothesis. Naive. But now, years later, I understand why Peter was telling me that if I design experiments that have a very high success rate, that means that I'm not challenging myself enough. That means I'm not pushing the boundary enough. Science means you must fail. If you know the answer ahead of time, then designing an experiment is not really the most productive thing that you can do with your time. You should go for things that you don't know about. And well, if you do that, look, there's going to be failure. So the best strategy is not to shoot for success, to shoot for a balance and ideally have risky projects with higher chance of failure than success, but also balance them with some other sure bet options. So that would mean that at each moment you would have at least 2 experiments. That was my working philosophy as a graduate student. Talking to Mike also clarified that that was a very productive thing to do. And again, as a graduate student and also as a postdoc, a fair number of my projects failed. Some of them because hypotheses were not so good and data did not support them, but some of them also because of logistic failures and challenges that would happen in any line of experimentation. I specifically remember I trained one of my animals for more than a year, and one day I come and unfortunately the implant broke. I felt that I felt devastated. It's like, man, this is a very important experiment. I really wanted to do it, and I put so much of my time into this. On the positive side, I had other experiments that were happening at the same time, and well, fortunately, I did not have failed implants for them. But it was a norm for me to be always involved in 2 to 3 experiments, usually with putting the majority of my focus on one, but pushing the ball forward at any rate that I could in the other ones to create guarantees. In a probabilistic process, well, the more balls you have in the air, the more likely it is that it
what have you found most challenging as faculty?
Oh man.
Where to start?
Yeah, where to start? I think that the main challenge that I faced, and I think many other people face too, is that where I started my lab, let me use myself as an example. I started my lab with a very clear example of what I wanted to do, or with a very clear thought of what I wanted to do. And I focused on them, but I wasn't trained extensively to deal with the human aspect of it. As a graduate student and as a postdoc, you are your own master. It's largely a one-man operation, or maybe a small group operation. Maybe you have another graduate student that you collaborate with, or another postdoc that you collaborate with. Maybe you have an undergrad that you supervise. I had all of those experiences, but supervising multiple postdocs and multiple graduate students and learning how to keep them productive, how to challenge them by the right amount, despite differences in style, background knowledge, interests, was something that had required a lot of learning on the job.
Can you give some examples of what went wrong?
Yes, yes, I can. I think for some of the graduate students and postdocs who came to the lab, I made the project a little bit too challenging. I should have encouraged a type of teamwork within the lab as opposed to one person, one project. And I relied quite a bit on kind of the verbal feedback that they would give me about their ability to do it. And I would like do a stress test that, are they doing it? And the answer was yes. But in retrospect, I think that a lot of them came under a little bit too much pressure.
From you?
Not from me, of course, from me, but to a large extent, I think from the experiments that they were doing. Experiments are becoming more and more challenging. Like in 2022, the complexity of the experiments that we are doing are substantially higher than those that I did as a graduate student or as a postdoc. And that would mean that when I was a graduate student, I would drop one electrode, I would record from one neuron, and I would be very happy if I could record a few neurons a week. Now we have hundreds of neurons recorded simultaneously. Even like bookkeeping of the data that you're collecting is not a very simple thing. And now on top of that, you have to be able to do analyses. You have to learn how to work with compute clusters, how to manage very large volumes of data, how to become very efficient in doing that so that your processes don't require 2.5 years to complete. And in many ways, thinking about it as a one-man job is probably not the right thing anymore. And thinking about a project as in a way that, okay, like a person would be doing the data collection and the animal training and theory side of it and the writing side of it. Sure, some people can, but some people also would require help, and I think that's totally fine. And in the very first years, like first couple of years, I was a little bit oblivious to it. That was the time that like large scale recording were just taking off. That was the beginning of Brain Initiative. We were doing a lot of pioneering work in terms of developing surgical techniques, pushing the boundary of the number of neurons that you can record, the number of brain areas that you can simultaneously record, the complexity of the tasks that you can develop. And I think maybe I should have created bigger groups to tackle these challenges. Now, after 2 or 3 years, we learned, and collaborations or more meaningful collaborations started to form. But in the first couple of years, I think we did not have the right type of organization. The other thing that I'm learning is that being a faculty is a continuous learning process. Techniques keep changing, questions keep changing, the time changes. And with the change of time, I, as a faculty, need to adapt myself. If I can't do that, well, then my lab is going to survive and flourish. But if I fail to do that, it can very quickly fail. Usually, like things have a cycle of 5 to 10 years. And if we don't adapt ourselves, well, we go extinct. And that is creating, I think, substantial excitement, but also angst. And balancing that is, I think, is the most important responsibility of the faculty.
How have your own life experience shaped your mentorships now?
Well, a lot changed since I became a faculty here. Well, when I started, I did not have a kid. Now I have a 4-year-old. He's almost 4 years old. And although the requirements of a kid, young kid, is very different from a graduate student, but and a postdoc, but there are many elements that are shared. Like trying to see the world from the perspective of the other person is a very important lesson. When I did not have a kid, I had the luxury of ignoring it at will, even though I knew the theory of it. Since and at this moment, because I have a kid and I practice that on a daily basis, that has become my default mode of operation. Now I need to opt for not seeing things from the other person's perspective. I think that's a very big change. And that changes the mentorship style and the type of feedback that I provide. I suspect that the people who have been in the lab before and after my son was born can share some experiences about this change in mentorship. That's that. I will repeat the question. I can also repeat the question.
So you mentioned kind of having to set everything up from the ground up with the his lab. What kind of potential advantage do you think that process brought to you? Having to do that, do you encourage people to kind of understand things from the bottom up in their own training? And then also, can you speak a little bit more to how you think we can increase accessibility to science globally?
Well, great questions. Setting up a lab at the time for me was a perfect experience. And I used quite a bit of that later on as a graduate student and then as a faculty. One thing that I learned there, which I would have probably been more hesitant to do if I had not gone through the experience, was inventing new things. Sometimes, I mean, this is, I think, a tendency that many humans have, that we usually try to do the job with the tools that we have, as opposed to trying to invent new tools that can do the job better. And when we are brought up in a particular tradition, we are given the tools, we are handed the tools, and then we say, okay, like with these tools, I can do this and this and that. And that would limit the questions that we ask. I think that would limit the way that we interpret the results that we have, and that would potentially change the follow-up questions or the follow-up work that we imagine. Okay, if I start this, where exactly it can go in years from now. Making a lab from scratch was an experience that taught me, well, even if you don't know it, that's totally okay. There is someone who knows it, and it's a matter of building the right type of network, reading the right type of manual, or finding the right type of article. So I think that increased my tolerance for uncertainty and encouraged innovation. And I'm trying to maintain that spirit, even though I have aged substantially since the time. I'm trying to keep those lessons alive in my head. And I think those are the lessons that have served me well. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has to build a lab from scratch or build a setup from scratch during their PhD or postdoc. If you find the opportunity, don't say no to it and accept it with open arms. You're going to just get better with it. But even if you don't find the opportunity, still you can know about the lesson and keep that in mind. And every time that you feel that you are rejecting a line of investigation because you don't have the tool for doing it, just take a step back and say, well, is that really a legitimate reason for me to rule that out? And the answer is almost always no. So you should rule out new lines of investigation or ideas that come to your mind based on their scientific value or scientific validity, as opposed to what you can or cannot do at this time. And also remember that technology keeps changing. And every 5 years or every 10 years, there is something that would totally change the scene. And position yourself for the revolution that will come, not the revolution that has just passed. I think that's the best advice that we can give. The second question, which is also extremely important, is about global accessibility. I had a very difficult time. I still remember like all the struggles. We did a lot of different things. And at the time I felt that we were so frustrated and desperate for knowledge that we felt, well, even if this thing that we are doing could be called pirating, like getting a textbook and creating photocopies of it instead of buying multiple copies of that, it is acceptable, because if you are in a country where the currency does not have adequate value and the price of principles of neuroscience is your annual salary, then the idea of buying it just doesn't make sense. Same for articles. I think a lot of these pieces of knowledge, which is effectively human legacy or human heritage, should be openly accessible, I would say, to everyone. And publishers should find some alternative ways to fund their operation and keep it alive. Many of them have got the whims, and I think that they know how to do things better at this moment. Like the embargo time that many journals have, that when a paper is published after a few months or after a year, it becomes openly accessible. Lifting firewalls and barriers for accessing articles in certain journals in specific countries. I think all of them are good moves, but I don't think they are enough. Like I'm still in touch with some students in Iran, and I know that they are struggling. The US sanctions don't help either. I mean, again, like either we think about knowledge as form of human heritage and we think it should be openly accessible, because with the right type of input, almost anyone can contribute. I think I'm a live example here. Again, like I'm coming from a small town in a country that is crushed under sanctions at this moment. And if I can be sitting in front of you and maybe sharing my life story and contributing to science, I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of other people in Asia, Africa, you name it, that can contribute to it with the right type of input. And we should ask ourselves, as a human community, are we really doing the best that we can to support them? And the answer is a clear no. I mean, I would challenge any politician that would say yes to that question. Now, what we can do, I think activism is very important. And as scientists, we should be aware of our social responsibility, not just to science, but also to humanity in general. Just the same way that we are careful in what question we ask, we are cognizant about ethics in the experiments that we do. We should also ask ourselves, well, what is the ethics of sharing and what can and cannot be shared? And instead of imposing blind sanctions and curtains and things, maybe we want to be a little bit more intelligent and a bit more selective. Now, again, the main barrier here is international politics and international economics that are keeping us divided in many ways. And I think as scientists, we can be potentially ambassadors that would connect different societies. At this moment, well, I'm an Iranian American. I'm also an American citizen. I care a lot about this country. I see it as my own country. And in many ways, because the United States is my adopted country, I feel even more responsibility towards it, because compared to someone who was born in this country and did not have a choice, I had a choice and I chose to become a citizen of this country. So I think with that choice comes responsibility, responsibilities that may be beyond those of a person who's just born in this country. And if I can do something to move the needle even by an epsilon, I think that is something that I should do. And I'm very happy that this awareness in the scientific community is growing. And many people are joining the movement and many people are spearheading it. I think one of them is sitting next to us here, Wei Ji. And I'm very happy that I'm in a department where people like Wei Ji are, and they are working hard to make things better.
Yeah, we're nearing the end, so I just have one concluding question for you. So if at this moment you could no longer be a scientist, but you have to choose a different career, what would you consider?
Can I become a graduate student?
No, that's true.
Because I would always go back to that. I think I would probably become a technician or a graduate student, or I don't know, a baker who bakes biscuits for monkeys. But if I really don't have the option, I think I would go back to my medical training and I would try to do something along those lines. Yeah, I hope that it will not happen.
Good. Thank you so much for your
Thank you so much.
honest, inspiring story. Thanks everyone for joining us online. Hopefully see you next time in the Burning Up.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Bye.